All good. Well, I'll start talking while everybody's getting adjusted. And introduce myself. I started working at Dolby at the beginning of last year. 20 odd years ago, one of my first jobs, I started working at the Cocktail Twin studio initially, but then came and started working here. So I used to make cables in a room just down there. And then I then sort of went from here to the strong room and then started working with Pete Townsend and The Who on and off for 18 years, blah, 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 until I eventually ended up working for Dolby at the beginning of last year. My own sort of route into this is quite interesting because back 25 years ago when I was working at the strong room or whenever it was, 5.1 was a thing. And we had a 5.1 room there. There was one here I seem to remember. And there was a sort of general idea that people would start making 5.1 records. And what was really interesting back then, and I was a snotty-nosed, cynical assistant, and I would just sort of generally took it, I was cynical about it, and the idea being, well, who's got this? Who listens? Who's going to listen to music this way? Anybody that I knew that was into this kind of thing was generally into movies and had a crap music taste. That was my opinion of it back then. And then when this came up, the idea about installing a Dolby Atmos system into a studio on a boat that I used to run, I started looking into it, and suddenly I realized this could work on headphones. This could work on other things outside of having to only sit on your sofa to listen to this extra disc that you bought and all this gear that you might have bought. So it sort of gained my interest, and then sure enough, I ended up working at Dolby. So I'm here to talk with some of the guys that are making some Atmos mixes. So if you just want to do a bit of an introduction to what you do and who you are and what you do, that would be great.
Right. Okay, first. So my name's Ali Staton. I'm a mixer predominantly and sometimes producer. I've been doing this professionally since 1989, which seems shocking to me. But I worked at commercial studios in London and then was in-house at Island Records just down the road when it was in St. Peter's Square in their studio, and then went freelance and have continued in that realm. So I've seen the transition from analog tape to digital audio workstations to now working in Dolby Atmos. And that's what I'm here to talk about.
My name is Mike Hillier. I'm one of the mastering engineers here at Metropolis. Hopefully you caught my thing earlier on, so you kind of got the basic idea of who I am. Yeah, I work here. I do a good portion of the Atmos work here. I've been at this is my second time at the studio. I started here in 2006 as a night receptionist and slowly worked my way up. I'm doing a bit better now.
Hi, I'm Prash, known as Engineers Mistry. I'm originally a producer, but now I'm mainly for the last decade a mix and mastering engineer and Atmos engineer. I run two Atmos studios. The first one launched at Tileyard, and then we expanded to a second one up in Norwich. I guess multiple Grammy nominations and Mercury nominations and all of those kind of things aside, you know, my focus is an obsession with audio. I'm in-house with Georgia Smith's label FAM. So I've worked with her and her team since the beginning. Liam Howlett, I'm in his in-house mastering engineer. And yeah, I work on multiple genres across international labels. And yeah, just trying to help them get their audio where they want it.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we've all got sort of different kinds of studios here. There's a commercial studio and then there's two kind of private studios involved here. So just without getting too nerdy and too into detail, how did you find the installation of your Atmos studio experience? Yeah, just tell us a little bit about the rooms that you're working in. Obviously, lots of people just think there's loads of speakers involved in this. So if you can just give us a rough idea about how you found that, what kind of prompted you to do it, and yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, let's go. We'll go in order.
I started looking into Atmos about a year and a half ago and made contact with Dolby directly, spoke to Myles, who we sort of knew each other a little bit, and they were incredibly helpful in helping me understand the format and what I would need. I have a small mix suite based at Real World Studios, which is just outside Bath, and I've been working in there for about 16 years. Mixing predominantly in my space, and then since about April this year, it's been set up for Dolby Atmos, and and it was, I did a lot of the work myself, so the DI aspect of it was pretty challenging, but the technical side of it was relatively straightforward, helped by the guys Richard and Myles at Dolby.
I think we started talking about an immersive room about 2.5 years ago, and we were looking to do it kind of unrelated to what we ended up doing it for. We had a few other ideas, and then about 1.5 years ago, just as it was very close to being finished, the Apple launch of Dolby Atmos happened, and kind of overnight our plans changed, and it was just kind of fortunate that everything had aligned in such a way that as that happened, we had a room that was going to be really easily kind of workable for that purpose. So it was all done by people far better than me. I had no part in the actual build itself. Just I came in and one day it was done.
Great.
It's great.
And yourself, Prash?
So hello, sorry. Ours came from a slightly different perspective because our first room was a stereo room, which we then adapted to Atmos. So that was a slightly different scenario. The main things, and our second room was a dedicated Atmos room. So the first room, when you're adapting a stereo room, audio is generally facing one way. It's the speaker's back. So you have to kind of alter your room to work best with the acoustics from an encompassing immersive experience. Whereas the second room was a dedicated Atmos room that was a lot easier to put that together. And yeah, we did it all ourselves. Actually, I don't think anyone in Dolby's been around yet, but you're welcome anytime. And yeah, we've delivered, thousands of mixes from there. And just through lots of referencing, room correction. Both of our rooms are the first Amphion rooms in the country as well. So we set them up. We found that was the right, you kind of don't need loads of massive speakers. You need the right speakers in the right places for localization. So that was really our approach to it, and making sure that it translated well to Apple and other delivery places.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, we won't go too deep into all of the nerdery of it, but I mean, we're talking about speakers here, but obviously there's got to be a route to those speakers, and as Mike talked about at the beginning, the whole point of this is free of speakers. However you listen to Dolby Atmos doesn't mean that you've got a particular set of speakers around you. It's not channel based anymore. It might be headphones, it might be a smart speaker which might have multiple speaker drivers in it, but it might not be the same speaker count as a 11.1.8 room downstairs or whatever, or a cinema. The whole point that this is a scalable playback thing, which sort of, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about beds and objects and things in a minute, again, without getting too nerdy. But the main thing I sort of will explain is that the tools that Jane was talking about, we have this thing called the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this renderer is a piece of software. Up to date, this has been a piece of software that has sat just after your DAW. So your Pro Tools, your Logic, your Cubase, Nuendo, DaVinci Resolve, and so on and so forth. The idea being that you come out of your DAW into the renderer. Now, as Mike was saying earlier on, traditionally you could look at the DAW as a mixing console. A lot of people mix in the box, as it were. Now there's a desk right there which has got hundreds of channels on it, or 90 something, and that traditionally would have gone down to a left and a right. So you're mixing down to a left and a right. The idea, as Mike said, is that you're no longer bouncing everything down to that bus, to that mix bus of two channels, or even 5.1, which is a 6-channel thing. The idea being that however you choose to align your tracks and however you choose to mix those together, you could have, traditionally a tape machine might have been a 16-track or a 24-track. You could have 24 items coming into the Dolby renderer, and then it works out where those items are placed in space with an X, Y, and Z coordinates, as Mike was talking about. So that's, so the idea of that is the renderer then chooses what to do in that particular playback instance. So in a studio, that's a 7.1.4 room or a 11.1.8 or whatever your studio is. It will take all of that information and you can then mix it appropriately so that it's working within your space. However, a version of that renderer sits on every one of those consumer devices. So if it's a smart speaker, for example, it will say, I'm a 5.1.2 smart speaker or soundbar or whatever. So I just need this little piece of rendering to work for what I am. And that's part of what Dolby does is sells that that particular possibility into each of those devices. So this renderer is available, as I said. It was previously available as an external to Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase, Nuendo, DaVinci Resolve. It's actually been integrated into a lot of those softwares already, and what we're hoping is it'll be integrated into all of them, of course, ultimately. But it's a quite simple thing. Once you get your head around it, there's a learning curve, which we'll talk about. But but the idea being that it's for every engineer that sort of gets on top of this, there's this learning curve. But it's quite a straightforward way of thinking about things once you get there. So maybe we can just talk about the learning curve a little bit. So how have you found that? Beds and objects, the idea that you're no longer thinking about a left and a right or five or whatever speakers. How have you found that? How have you found that learning process? How long did it take? Yeah, let's go the other way.
Sure. So one of the reasons I initially got into Atmos was to maintain QC for our clients on the stereo level. So we were delivering mix and masters for these artists, and the version that was going online sounded very, very different to the mix and master we'd spent many months getting right. So when we came to building the studio, and even when it came to how we approached the mixes and the workflow, it all was with respect to the stereo original. We had to make sure that all of that artistic intention was delivered correctly through to Apple or wherever it was going to live afterwards. So the workflow for us was always making sure that we can go back and reference that original mix, make sure that that's correct, and then extend the technical kind of fascination of immersive audio from there. So that was how we approached it.
Yeah, it was much the same for me. My interest in Atmos stemmed from exactly that. It was I've built relationships with artists and producers and labels and creators, and you work for weeks and weeks on a stereo mix, as I've done for years, and then the idea of then handing that over to a third party who doesn't have that connection because they basically had the tools was the kind of impetus for me to go, well, I need to invest in that so that there's someone on the inside of that creative team who can oversee that next stage of the process. Plus, I've just got an interest in audio fundamentally, so I wanted to experience that technology as well and make that part of what I can offer the artists that I work with.
And I mean, where that's concerned, obviously, Mike, you're a mastering engineer as well. So, where Ali said that he wanted to keep hold of his, his stereo work and then take it into Atmos and Prash as well. But there are some people who are kind of quite happy to hand over their stereo stems, for example, which I guess is, people have had this misnomer of, can I master in Atmos? And, what that means to people is slightly different. So maybe you can explain a bit about that and then what you've been doing on that front.
Yeah, so I guess that's right. The big difference is I'm a mastering engineer. Most of what I do, even in the stereo world, is taking on things that these guys have been working on, or other engineers, for a long time, and then I work on it for a few hours, and it's a very different kind of role. And so in the Atmos space, I'm mostly doing the same thing. Not 100%. Some of the stuff is stuff that I've done the stereo mix for. But a lot of it is stuff where I'm being sent stems, and similar to what these guys were both saying, actually, my goal is just to make it sound like the stereo version, but immersive. Like I want you to be, I want the music to be the thing that pushes me in the direction that I take it, and not the technology. I think one of the fears that a lot of people have, whether they're artists or other engineers, because we engineers, we really do care about the music that we're working on and that we're putting out. And so when we listen to something, we don't want that thing to be just, and now this bit spins because it can, and this bit's gone behind me because it can. It's got to whatever's in the music has to be the thing that makes that decision. And a lot of the time, it's a lot like mastering. You know, when I sit down to do a master, I listen to the song and I go, oh, I know what has to happen now. I know, you know, it needs a bit more of this. It needs squashing here. It needs multi-band. It needs widening here, blah, blah, blah. And then I go into Atmos and I'm like, okay, I know what needs to happen here. That thing needs to go over there. That thing needs to go from back to front. And that thing needs a bit of height to it. It's there already. I'm just doing it.
Yeah. What I draw from this, and obviously I'm meeting lots of different people all the time. And what's really interesting that this is covering lots of bases. You know, within the cut and thrust hardcore pop world is actually, it's not unusual for somebody to go, here's the stuff, mix it, then get it mastered. And I'm not suggesting that artist isn't particularly involved, but sometimes that may be the case. However, with other people, they might get, you know, artists themselves might get deeply involved in it. And, you know, there's people like Hillier here who, you know, are actually getting fully involved in the technology themselves, using Ableton Live in her case, or Logic or whatever. And they can get into this themselves and they can take that right through to the end. Other people in bands or whatever might have some interest. They might be involved in, you know, coming in and being involved in that mix. Or it might be a case of, we're handing this to somebody who's going to do a great job. So it's quite reassuring that we're covering all bases here and in the room, and that seems to be the way things are working. I just wanted to go on to headphones, which you started talking a little bit about before. Something like 80-ish%, don't quote me on that, of music is listened to on headphones anyway, just by default, just, you know, the way that we go about our daily lives. So, and as I said before, my interest in this instantly became higher when I knew that this worked on headphones and binaural listening. So I've got my own thoughts on that, and the way that I kind of visualize it and theorize it is that we've been generally mixing across two speakers in a room, and what we've been listening to on headphones for the last 50 years is that speaker and that speaker bolted onto our ears, firing directly in. There's a 60-degree angle from, you know, stereo in its original form was a microphone pointing there, a microphone pointing there, and as a result of that kind of image that you got between the two, if that was an orchestra or whatever, gave you something that felt like you were standing in front of it. That was the idea of stereo, and that evolved with mixing desks and, you know, left and right buses and the Beatles and the Stones and all of those people that would shove the drums that side. If you think about Crosstown Traffic by Jimi Hendrix, when there's a guitar at the beginning that goes da 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 da, that's because they were probably in the studio that had a pan pot for the first time. Prior to that, you could go left or right or both. That's what it was about. So what we've been thinking with stereo, you know, for headphones wise, is actually technically quite weird what we've been listening to. You've mixed it for some speakers that are there in a room, and then you bolt it onto your head and you don't get the same experience. It's not like sitting in the sweet spot of a studio. So you, as Mike said before, you're binauralizing. The whole idea is you should be being placed into a space, but what should that space be? So I just want to see what, you know, with the tools that are given, how do you go about taking something, you know, you've been working in stereo for a long time. How do you get the idea about creating an immersive mix that isn't crazy? Or how do you control that? How do you make sure that thing that people are listening to is what you think the audience want to hear? Let's start here.
So, well, obviously I've spent a long time working in stereo, so I'm very comfortable in that. And that's how we've all listened to music for a long time. And stereo mixing, especially now the track count in the last 20 odd years have gone up. You know, we used to be limited to 24 tracks analog, and you had to deliver all of your creative ideas in that song, that production, on that sort of limited format. Now with, you know, all the DAWs around, there's literally no limit. I mean, some of the multi-tracks I get are 160 plus tracks of audio. It's really difficult. Well, it's hard enough just to sit there and listen through all of that stuff when you receive it, to then start to make an idea of how you're going to deliver that person's production so that it can be listened to across a wide range of different listening devices. And people have kind of become focused on making things louder and sort of brighter and really squashing all of that information into this stereo spectrum. And in a way, Atmos has sort of freed that up a little bit. It's not quite as hard to squeeze all of that data and information across the stereo spread. You've got a little bit more of a plane in which to present those artistic ideas, to let elements feature so that the listener can feel emotionally moved by something. And it's not fighting for space in this sort of conventional stereo mix. And that's been quite a revelation for me. It's actually opened up a load more creative opportunities that you just couldn't achieve previously. So that's been a really positive thing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from my perspective, the way I've always been excited about mixing is to kind of envisage it as a 3D space anyway. Even if you've only got the two speakers, it's kind of perceiving a sphere around that listening area. So we were always investing in strange binaural tools, weird effects units, choruses, to try and create that placement in stereo anyway, so that when you heard a mix on headphones, it would blow you away. It would make your mix sound just that little bit extra special, which gets people more involved in the music. So when Atmos, originally I was on Auro 3D on Blu-ray, then when Atmos came around, it just expanded that. So we could expand that toolbox of tricks and actually apply them to genuine audio delivery. Just say, right, we want something to feel like it's there. I can just put it there, and it can still feel like that, and it can still move as one thing, but be placed in an emotionally contextual way. So, yeah, I don't think it was necessarily a barrier, as more of a veil being dropped and having to use less weird effects to achieve the same goal. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Mike, have you got any thoughts in terms of, how do you build a depth in binaural? Would you just take something and say, let's plonk you down, let's take this mix that I've got in this room. So you're mixing in the room downstairs. Should it sound the same as it sounds in that room? Should it be the same as other studios that we've got up and running, like Abbey Road something, or British Grove something, or a tiny cupboard studio? We've seen a few of those as well. How do you go about, what should it sound like, or should it be individual items? We've got these things called binaural metadata settings, for example. Are they something that you're using a lot of?
Yeah, it's not done until those are part of the mix. That is as I was going to say as important, but probably even more important actually than everything else. It, as you mentioned, it's 80-90% of people who are listening on headphones. So if you don't pay attention to the binaural metadata, then you're missing the point, and you're not producing a final mix. It's just not finished. The way I would go about that, I have tried doing a mix entirely on headphones and then taking them off and listening to it in the room. Mm-hmm. Wasn't a good experience. Working the other way around does tend to work. When I build my mix into the room, put the headphones on, I set my metadata up, and there's a certain amount of that which is just, oh look, I know I want this to be far. It's a far away sound. It's supposed to be distant. And there's a certain bit of where you're like, let's just test. Let's just play around. Then you as you play around, you get closer or further away from what you think is the best presentation of that piece of music. And sometimes it does surprise you, and you end up placing things in positions that you wouldn't necessarily have guessed at. But then the goal, once I do that, is that I put the headphones on, and I feel like I'm in the same space that I was in, a minute ago when I didn't have the headphones on. And the big kind of technological leap for me was when earlier this year, the beta version of the personalized head-related transfer functions came out. And I actually got that, which I'd never got before. The default HRTF, the average human head, is not my head. It definitely isn't my head. And so when I put the headphones on originally, I felt like I was having to learn how to listen binaurally. And things sounded spatial. I could kind of go, oh yeah, that thing is now vaguely over this way somewhere, but I couldn't place it. And then with the personalized head-related transfer function, things just got a lot more localized very quickly. And I found that really exciting.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of some kind of psychoacoustic learning that happens anyway. If we've all been listening to two speakers, strapped onto our heads from a stereo mix, when you have to actually really start listening, which is great, because you suddenly start when it kind of locks. It's fantastic.
Myles, can I add something? Good. So one of the challenges I think with this format, just over the last couple of years, which is getting much better now, is that spatial audio. So there's two things. We've got Atmos, for which we listen to binaurally, but then spatial audio, which is Apple's adaptation of Atmos, which you're listening to in your AirPods. Now that actually completely strips away all of the Dolby metadata, which can be a bit of a challenge for us mixers, because we'll, as these guys know, spend ages building this beautiful headphone mix, and then it's gone when it goes to AirPods. So I've found referencing through Apple extremely important. We have to have, I've got 2 different generations of AirPods. I've got AirPod Maxes. We've got a laptop from Apple routed to our Atmos system. You know, we're literally checking on all of those delivery systems, because it doesn't matter how good it sounds to us. If it goes out and it doesn't resonate with the listener like the stereo does, or God forbid, worse than the stereo, we're in big problems. And the artist may or may not have heard it, and they may not have signed it off. It might be an A&R. And if the artist then hears it and we're back to remixing, that's a big challenge. So I think really referencing on the products and the destination where the most people want to listen to, we found really important in the long run.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to make. That's not really name. 5 minutes. Okay, lovely. So, well, thanks. I mean, I know you're asking me a question now. It's quite a tricky one to answer on a camera. But yeah, you know, we talked about binaural metadata settings, the idea that you can build a mix out. Yeah, I mean, that's the way that the Dolby have created these tools, and that makes sense. So, you know, that's the way it sounds in the studio. You know, and as you say, there are other versions of that. You can take a Dolby mix. You can do, you know, the ADM format itself is a, you know, is a open format. You can play it back however you want. But ultimately, yes, generally speaking, you've mixed it using those binaural metadata settings, and I imagine, or perhaps you can tell me, that's the way you'd like it. You know, you'd like to
definitely love Apple to take binaural settings.
Cut that all out. Thank you. So one other thing that it's not written down here, but actually somebody asked the question earlier on about upmixing and upmixing and obviously splitting stems or making a multi-track from something that exists on a stereo from the past. And you know, Mike made a good point that you know, if you're there are upmixing things that allow you to take stereo and it does some special stuff and it does make it sound more spacious. However, what we've been talking about here when we're talking about objects and tracks and what have you is the idea that you can make a discrete Atmos mix where you get to choose where those things go around you. And you mentioned a little bit about sort of demixing software, things that takes that will take a stereo mix, and it's kind of like the holy grail, really, the idea that you can take a stereo mix and find a lost you know, a missing multi-track. You can go in there and say, that's the guitar, that's the bass, those are the drums, there's the vocal, there's the synthesizer, whatever. And there, yeah, as you say, there's the possibilities there are really increasing. There's lots of movement forward in terms of being able to do that. And then you can do an Atmos mix with those. Yeah, if you can't find the multi-track and that's the absolute, you know, or there's no stems or whatever, then yeah, of course, that's a way you can go back and you can do a special job. It's better to do that than to upmix it, I would say. Hopefully you would agree with that. But yes, it's definitely worth going back to the highest quality original source and mixing from that. I mean, hopefully, I just wanted to get that in as a kind of, as part of that question from earlier. So finally, we've got 3 minutes now. So what do you hope and expect to see happen with Immersive and with Atmos? What, you know, where we're at now is there's lots of people listening to it, we hope. And in terms of, you know, devices out there, there are cars on their way. We've got a car in the Dolby office. So as Jane says, anybody that hasn't been down, please come down and listen to our facilities and we can guide you through it. We've got a Volvo that Dolby have put together with Bowers and Wilkins speakers in, which sounds fantastic. So please do. But what are your thoughts and what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would encourage you all to take up that offer because if you haven't yet heard immersive sound or Dolby Atmos in a speaker environment, that's definitely worth it. The mixes that I've done where I've managed to get artists to come down, or in case we came up to Dolby's facility in London, it had a really profound effect, and it's great. And so I'm all for encouraging.
Emily was in tears.
She was, yeah. Encouraging people to experience it, and hopefully, you know, hardware manufacturers will bring on board sound bars and headphones, and so that we can push the technology out and allow listeners and the consumers to really experience the benefits.
Yeah. What do you mind?
I guess there's a couple of things from a creative point of view that I'd like to see. The first of those is somewhat obvious, which is just artists getting on board with conceptualizing their Atmos mix at the like earlier and earlier stages of production. So rather than just kind of dumping a bunch of stems on me at the end and going, well, the stereo's done, so give me an Atmos, kind of going, here is the plan. We did it from the very beginning. These extra tracks we recorded just for the Atmos version, and we need this part to do this. And whenever I've been in the studio with an artist for doing demos, the look on their face, like the creative ideas that are coming instantly, they're just like, oh, and I've had musicians literally say, I've got an idea for an entirely new part for this song now. Like, you can't put it on. You can't. It's too late. So that more and more artists thinking about that earlier is going to be fantastic. But I would also like to see more tools, more like creative tools from our end. So at the moment, it's really fascinating to get in and be kind of automating all of these elements. But I'm excited to see what happens next with plugins that perhaps, I've got ideas for like things that could happen, like plugins that would maybe be do the automation kind of in response to things that happen, and just new creative ideas coming through in that sense.
Great, thank you. What about yourself, Prash?
Yeah, I think Mike's covered a lot of that actually. I think people composing with an Atmos situation in mind from the beginning, I think, is going to be fascinating. Score composers being able to write with Atmos in mind from the offset is just a brilliant thing to happen. For me, thinking about tools, a really good automation tool, a physical way to move things around the space. Personally, I don't think it exists yet.
Yeah.
It's still a bit, okay, we've got to move this lever and this knob to move it around. Yeah. There still needs to be a better solution for that.
Yeah, we're creating access for all of that, in terms of the SDKs and stuff, and the software getting into the DAWs, that it's all available for people to be able to access. So that's great.
Yeah, that's it. And I think other than that, it's just, more and more of this out there in the environment for people to hear it. I think we're on that track already.